Okay, let's get on with it. Today's subject matter is Donkey Kong Jr. for the Atari 7800 Pro System, one of the few 7800 video games to be graced with a color label, a privilege that is usually reserved for games labeled with a Super Game Cartridge thing, such as Hat Trick or Karateka. The funny thing being that Donkey Kong Jr. is more of a Super Game Cartridge than either of the two mentioned titles, but that's another story for another day. No doubt old school gamers are already familiar with the premise of Donkey Kong Jr., but for the uninitiated, Donkey Kong Jr. places you in the role of the title character, in which you have to save your dad, Donkey Kong Sr., from the evil Mario, who will stop at nothing to impede your progress by sending his various animal slaves after you. Now that's just riveting storytelling there, folks, and it was enough to get you pumped up for action to brave the game's various cunning challenges. And make no mistake, in the days before full-motion video cinemas and 90-minute cutscenes that lasted 5 years between interactive segments, this was all the backstory we ever really needed, and it was beautiful. Now the 7800 port of Donkey Kong Jr. does retain all the arcade levels, so you have your first level, your bird level, your electric level, and your final level, and you also have the ending sequence that will play when you clear the final level, which meant absolutely nothing back in the day because you just went back to the first level and started the whole thing all over, except things were a tad harder. Back in those days, kiddies, it was all about the points. It was all about the points. Just ask the hot sauce guy, but that's besides the point. Donkey Kong Jr. is a pretty enjoyable platformer for the most part. Jr. is somewhat more agile than Mario was in the previous game. Sure, he still controls like a tank somewhat with his slow speed, but Jr. can climb one chain, can climb two chains for extra speed, drop down chains rather quickly, drop fruit from chains to kill various animals. The chimp's a chain master, I tell ya! Control in Donkey Kong Jr. is tight, responsive, and easy to figure out, as you only need one button to play the game, and that's the jump. So if you're not a fan of the stock 7800 Pro line joystick, you could swap it for something else and you could still play the game effectively. In terms of graphics, the best way I can describe the Atari 7800 port of Donkey Kong Jr. is that it's essentially a lower resolution version of the NES port of the same game. For the most part, the game looks pretty close to the arcade original in terms of the visuals and the level layout, but does bear an appearance that's a little rough around the edges, almost a rather chunky appearance in some way. Even with this in mind though, it's still visually appealing and miles above the Atari 2600 version of Junior, which looked barren and well, not very good, but then again, that goes without saying. Sound in Donkey Kong Jr. is not the most pleasant thing in the package, however. While the game does manage to replicate the original sound and jingles of the arcade game, and does it rather well for the most part, don't get me wrong, it's somewhat ruined by the poor 7800 sound capabilities, which comprise recycled 2600 sound processing. As such, the audio portion of Junior is a bit weak and can be irritating at times. It's difficult to fault the game itself when this is more of a hardware issue than anything else, but even so, some Atari 7800 video games sound better than others. Donkey Kong Jr., sadly, is one of the others. All things considered, Donkey Kong Jr. is a rather respectable, pretty decent conversion on the Atari 7800 Pro system in a rather sizable line of decent arcade conversions on the console. Controls tight, gameplay's basic, and as per the case with a number of 7800 games, you have traditional difficulty select. While it does have its rough spots around the edges, Junior still manages to pull off the classic arcade gameplay with no major issues. This isn't necessarily a killer app for the 7800, nor should it be a reason for you to get your hands on a 7800 console, especially if you already own an NES, which already has a better version of Donkey Kong Jr. overall. But even so, this 7800 iteration of Donkey Kong Jr. is a solid piece of work and makes for a nice addition to any 7800 library.